Hello there, Mario fans. This video serves as a kind of appendix to my recent Year of Mario series by gathering together all of the legacy segments from those videos in one place. Because a big part of the concept for the series was to chronicle the introduction of various classic elements to the Mario universe over time, I thought this would be an interesting and concise way to sum it all up. Naturally, that means most of what you'll see here is previously existing content, but I have created a new legacy segment for Yoshi's Island, since my original video for that game didn't have one. After doing a few more videos on later games in the series, I've come around to the idea that Yoshi's Island may have been a bit more influential than I initially gave it credit for. Plus, I gave games like New Super Mario Bros. The legacy treatment, so I really have no excuse for not finishing the job by doing all 12 properly. Anyway, without further ado, enjoy! Now for the fun part. Well, fun for me anyway. Tallying up all the contributions that Super Mario Bros. Made to the Mario series as a whole. And wow, there's a lot to cover here. Nintendo really came out swinging with this first entry. So for convenience's sake, I'm going to group these contributions into three broad categories: characters and story, enemies and gameplay, and general design concepts. Mario and Luigi already existed prior to Super Mario Bros., but here we see the first appearance of damsel in distress, occasional partner, and overall sidekick Princess Toadstool, later called Peach, her loyal subjects the Toads, Mushroom People, and main villain Bowser, King of the Koopas, along with the Mushroom Kingdom, where most games in the series take place, at least partially. As for the actual plot, there really isn't one. Later games in the series would do a lot to flesh the story out, but here it's a basic rescue the princess plot that doesn't even really rise to the level of a fairy tale. Enemies, on the other hand, are one area where Super Mario Bros. Goes above and beyond. In fact, you could argue that back in the mid to late 80s, Nintendo's greatest strength was enemy variety. It's true of Mario, The Legend of Zelda, and the original Metroid. So many iconic enemies emerged here for the first time. We've got Goombas, Koopas, Piranha Plants, Cheep Cheeps, Bullet Bills, Hammer Brothers, and Lakitus. Buzzy Beetles and Bloopers are arguably a little less important, but we'll be seeing them again before too long. For power-ups, we have the first appearance of mushrooms, stars, and the game-changing Fire Flower. And speaking more generally, there's the idea of Mario stomping on enemies to defeat them, and breaking blocks to find power-ups and secrets inside. Even more generally, we have the idea of Mario traversing 8 unique worlds, which would prove to be a surprisingly durable idea, if a bit arbitrary. There's the geometric grid-like appearance of the graphics, which the series evolved past fairly quickly, but still clung to in places as a kind of nostalgic souvenir. By the 2000s, Nintendo was even joking about it, with levels like the Bitlands and Super Paper Mario. This is the game that gave us collecting 100 coins for a 1-up, testing the player's jumping skills for extra points at the end of a level, moving platforms, and the level timer, which speeds up the music once you hit 100 seconds, so you'll stop dawdling around and finish the level before Mario literally dies from boredom. One thing that really stood in the way of Super Mario Bros. 2 making a lasting contribution to the Mario series as a whole was that in every other way besides basic mechanics, it didn't really build on the legacy of Super Mario Bros. Itself. It features an entirely different set of enemies, an almost entirely different collection of useful items. The mushroom and the star are the only ones both games have in common, and a design approach that prioritized enemy encounters over the first game's trademark platforming. If Nintendo had really cared about not polluting Mario's brand identity or confusing customers, they would undoubtedly have treated the American sequel as a one-off experiment that overreacted to the Japanese sequel's excessive faithfulness by going way too far in the opposite direction. Whether it sold well or not, they would have treated it as a non-canonical curiosity, rather than something that build future games off of. And in the short run, you could be excused for thinking that this is exactly what they planned to do. Super Mario Bros. 3, revolutionary as it was, clearly took the original game as its template, for better or for worse. The same sequel, which included every single enemy from Super Mario Bros., on top of a dozen or so totally new ones, featured precisely one enemy that was introduced in Super Mario Bros. 2, the Bob-omb. Luigi was back to being a palette swap of Mario, with no special moves. Princess Toadstool and Toad returned to their status as NPCs. And we witnessed the triumphant return of the classic left-to-right platforming level, with little up-and-down movement and no boss encounters to muddle things up. By being so willfully different, Super Mario Bros. 2 denied its series the possibility of evolving in a simple, obvious direction, with one game clearly springing off from the point where the last one stopped. Instead, the Mario series would be characterized by a kind of convergent evolution, in which two separate foundations were built up simultaneously until they started to approach each other and fuse into something quite different from what either had started out as. Many things in Super Mario Bros. 2 would eventually reappear, but only a little bit at a time. Nintendo clearly treated Super Mario Bros. 2 as more of a spice than an ingredient, something that would ruin the uniqueness of future projects if they just dumped it all in at once. It can be difficult to trace the influence that it's had on the rest of the series, because that influence is very diffuse. So when I discuss the various legacy aspects of this game, bear in mind that several of the things I bring up were absent for much of the series, and only became essential after being reintroduced by another sequel years later. Okay, here goes. The story is one of the areas in which Super Mario Bros. 2 was most innovative, for a video game at least. But possibly for that exact reason, it's also what later games in the series did the least to build on. Mario traveling through a dream world is a concept we haven't really seen since, although the setting being influenced by various real-world cultures is. That's a thread that runs through all kinds of otherwise very different Mario games, from Super Mario Land to Super Mario Odyssey, and may have helped to inspire the globe-trotting feel of RPGs, like Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door. Super Mario Bros. 2 also didn't introduce a single major character to the series besides Birdo, who didn't start out as a character per se. Mario, Luigi, Princess Toadstool, and even Toad had all been seen before, and while this was the first time Toadstool and Toad were playable, that hardly counts as a legacy thing, because neither of them was playable in the main series again for a good long time. Not only that, but when Toad reappeared in New Super Mario Bros. Wii, he no longer had any special abilities. Choosing him is a purely cosmetic decision, with no effect on gameplay. Luigi's high jump ultimately became a major part of his character, but that wasn't introduced here either. He had it earlier in the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. As for enemies, I already pointed out that only Bob-ombs made it into Super Mario Bros. 3. But Super Mario World brought back the cactus-like Pokies and the hard-to-describe Ninjas. And Shy Guys would become hugely important to the series, starting with Yoshi's Island, which had like a million different types of Shy Guy. Like Goombas from the original Super Mario Bros., Shy Guys arguably punch well above their weight in terms of influence on later games in the series. Then we have items. Yeah. None of these became essential to Mario in later entries, except the POW block, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't invent that. It originally appeared in the arcade Mario Bros. In 1983, with pretty much the same function. Overall design concepts are where we get to the most interesting aspect of this game's contribution. What Super Mario Bros. 2 brought to the design of Mario wasn't a collection of design concepts so much as an attitude and a willingness to break the mold. I struggle to think of a single stage or part of a stage that clearly inspired an homage in later Mario games, except maybe the Phanto segments. But the idea that Mario could do more than run right and jump, that he could climb, dig, fall down, retrace his steps to find secrets, and venture in and out of buildings, these things were all unique to Super Mario Bros. 2 when it first came out. Picking up and throwing things didn't last long as a combat mechanic, but it did stick around. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you can pick up a Koopa shell and throw it instead of just kicking it, and you have to do so to obtain many hidden items. In Super Mario World, keys return, albeit as a way of unlocking secret exits rather than locked doors. The original concept would return later in Yoshi's Island. And finally, while Birdo herself never appeared again as a mini-boss, the idea of a mini-boss, specifically one that can be defeated by turning its own weapons against it, well, that's such a commonplace in the Mario series today that we don't even notice it. You can hardly find a boss throwing things at you in a Mario game that you can't defeat by whipping its own projectiles back at it. It's a testament to the inventiveness of Super Mario Bros. 3 that even though it reuses just about everything that appeared in the original Super Mario Bros., it still added more to the legacy of the franchise than either of its illustrious predecessors. Super Mario Bros. 3 is the quintessential Mario game, a template that would go on to be tinkered with and improved upon for decades to come, even after Mario entered the third dimension and totally abandoned the approach of the original trilogy. That world map and its design implications could still be seen in every new entry. With the resurgence of 2D Mario in the mid-2000s, beginning with New Super Mario Bros. In 2006, this became even more obvious. The whole New Super Mario Bros. Series took a lot of pointers from the design of this game, both mechanically and aesthetically. Just look at those world themes. It's no coincidence that half a dozen enemies which had only previously appeared in Super Mario Bros. 3 suddenly cropped back up when Mario returned to its 2D roots. This was just the final confirmation of the essential truth that if you're going to make a retro 2D platformer, this is what you want it to look and play like. Super Mario World, the first 16-bit game in the series, was a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Shovel Knight is a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Heck, with a little imagination, you could even say that Mario Party is basically a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Just replace the stages with minigames and the minigames with chance time, and you're halfway there already. But let's not get too worked up here. In some respects, the story in particular, this game is a bit of a lightweight. It introduced no new characters except for the Koopalings, who are only debatably characters anyway. Even Birdo ended up with spoken dialogue before these guys did, since for a long time they were basically retconned in favor of stories featuring Bowser Jr. What else even is there from a story perspective? Princess Toadstool talking? I guess that's something, but it's a pretty bare foundation to build a character off of. Arguably, most Mario characters only have real personalities in the RPGs and a few other spin-offs. The mainline series has deliberately kept them simple and straightforward. Except for Sunshine, but that's definitely a topic for another day. Now here we're on firmer ground. Super Mario Bros. 3 is a treasure trove of new enemies and mechanics. Here we find the definitive versions of most of the original Super Mario Bros. Foes, plus at least a dozen more that either settled into the franchise for the long haul, or at least inspired long-running enemy characters in later entries. 4 enemies proved to be especially influential in later games: Dry Bones, Thwomps, Chain Chomps, and Boos, all of which are series mascots of a sort, appearing in not just mainline Mario games, but also the racing games, sports games, and many other spin-offs. The Super Leaf didn't return for a long time, but if you think of it as just the flying power-up, flying definitely became an essential Mario concept for years to come. The cape in Super Mario World, the wing cap in Super Mario 64, Flood in Super Mario Sunshine, B Mario from Galaxy. This was an idea with legs. And how about those world themes? Grassland, Desertland, Waterland, Iceland, the Dark World. These ideas all seem stale now just because they've been used so many times. In the case of the first 3, often in exactly the same order. But that's not this game's fault. Really, it just shows how fundamentally appealing these themes are. And I would argue that Super Mario Bros. 3 does them the best of any game that's tried. Finally, let's not forget about the new stage concepts this game introduced. Auto-scrolling stages are the most obvious innovation, but there's also the increased focus on puzzle solving and thorough level exploration, directly inspiring some of the weirder and more out-there aspects of Super Mario World, a game that has a lot more in common with Super Mario Bros. 3 than I've seen most people acknowledge. As for overall design contributions, the most momentous has to be the invention of the world map and everything that went with it. Before Super Mario Bros. 3, the Mario series didn't really have its own unique way of presenting levels to the player. The strict level-by-level progression wasn't that different from what you'd see in a game like Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania. Compare this with, say, Mega Man, which back in 1987 was already shaking things up by letting you play through its first 6 levels in any order. Now, in 1988, the Mushroom Kingdom had a unique structural hook that told the world, this is Mario, and the way his games work isn't the same as anyone else's. Super Mario Bros. 3 gave us the concept of a minigame with power-ups as prizes, too, creating a sideline of the Mario franchise, which eventually became its own sub-series, Mario Party. I know that I called the slot machine from the last game a minigame, but that was a stretch. I don't have any problem referring to the card-matching game that way, and this is what I see the minigame concept growing out of. Another new idea was the contrast between fortresses and castles, which gave each individual world more structure and a sense of progression that didn't exist before. And finally, on a very broad level, the whole idea that each world in a Mario game needs to have a theme and a name started here. The worlds in the first 2 Mario games weren't named, they were numbered. And as unique as some of them were, they aren't as memorable as a place you can put a name to. They just don't have that sense of personality that this game's kingdoms have. In retrospect, the fact that Super Mario World was such a great game feels a little bittersweet, because in a way it was the last of its kind. 5 years would go by before the release of its sequel, and while I love Yoshi's Island and consider it one of the best games ever made, it's also very different in terms of core mechanics and level design. Playing as Yoshi just doesn't evoke the same nostalgic feeling that playing as Mario does. You could get a bit of that feeling from playing Super Mario Land 2, I guess, which was closer to the classic Mario style than its predecessor was, but an experience designed for the Game Boy was never going to compete in terms of spectacle and scale with a series that originally made its mark on home consoles. The power gap between the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy was enormous, and clever design could only do so much to bridge it. If you were waiting around for a proper 2D sequel to Super Mario World, you were in for a long wait. I don't think the new Super Mario Bros. Series really counts, because none of those games took a huge leap of innovation the way Mario's first 4 outings did. I'm not saying these are bad games, but they were pretty derivative, probably intentionally so. My personal opinion is that 2D Mario was stuck in a rut of endlessly rehashing Super Mario Bros. 3 until the release of Super Mario Wonder a few years ago, which really felt like it was taking Mario somewhere he'd never been before. So when we talk about the legacy of Super Mario World, part of that legacy is its status as a milestone that marks the end of classic Mario, and his subsequent voyage into strange new lands of spin-offery. However, that is only one thing, and this game had a lot more to offer than that. For instance, Yoshi is in this game. And Yoshi is a big, big deal. He was the Baby Yoda of his day, a merchandising bonanza that also gave Nintendo countless ideas for future stories. There's an alternate universe somewhere in which after Yoshi's Island came out, Nintendo just kept making Yoshi games for 30 years, and Mario became a side character in his own franchise. Another story innovation is the establishment of continuity from one game to the next. Super Mario World was the first Mario game to acknowledge the events of a previous game in its story. Mario, Luigi, and the princess are taking a vacation because of what happened in Super Mario Bros. 3. There are references to it in the gameplay too, like the sunken ship that guards the entrance to Bowser's Valley, which looks like what would happen if an airship from the previous game crashed into the sea. You even finish the stage by picking up one of those magical orbs that used to appear after you defeated Boom Boom in a fortress. That's about it for story stuff, unless you count Bowser riding in the Koopa clown car. That stuck around, it's just not exactly rich with implications for Bowser's personality. But really, this is Mario. What else would you expect? You want story? Go play Zelda. One of the clearest ways in which Super Mario World marks the end of the classic Mario era is the basic enemy types it added to the series' playbook. This is the last Mario game to introduce more than a handful of enemy types that would become standard in future entries. If it didn't show up by this point, it probably doesn't appear in more than 2 or 3 games in the whole series up to the present day, not counting spin-offs, of course. Super Mario World's new enemies aren't as prominent in the iconography of the series as boos or thwomps, but a few of them managed to book an appearance in several future games. I'd say the most essential additions were Fuzzies, Wigglers, Swoopers, Spike Tops, Magic Koopas, and especially Monty Moles, who appear in a staggering number of Mario games and spin-offs for an enemy that was never a playable character until Mario Kart Tour in 2020. He just seemed to pop up all over the place, which is quite fitting now that I think of it. Mario's new spin jump returned as a core mechanic in Super Mario Land 2, but after that it never reappeared in exactly the same form. The spin jumps in 3D Mario are quite different, particularly because they don't let you jump on otherwise hazardous surfaces, which is most of what you get out of doing it in this game. There's also all the new stuff associated with Yoshi, the way Mario rides on his back, his ability to swallow enemies, the idea that he eats fruit to make special things happen, the association with eggs. Although originally it was Yoshi who got stuck in an egg by Bowser, the idea of Yoshi turning enemies into eggs would have to wait until Yoshi's Island. And as far as core mechanics are concerned, that's about it. Oh, I guess Mario's cape got brought back in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Does that count? I guess that counts. More so than story or gameplay mechanics, map and stage design is the area in which Super Mario World really shines. The troubling thing is that many of its innovations weren't followed up on by the rest of the series. To this day, there's never been another map in a Mario game with the flexibility of Dinosaur Land, a place with so many secrets in it that it almost feels like finding secrets is more important than beating Bowser. Later games in the series, 2D ones anyway, have been more structured and focused, and while that was probably the right move, it's still a bit disappointing. One change that did become standard was the idea of a distinction between fortresses and castles, with fortresses holding mini-bosses and marking a kind of halfway point through an area, and castles holding bosses and marking the end of an area. Since both castles and fortresses appeared in Mario games before, you might not realize that Super Mario World did this first, but the earliest games with castles did not have fortresses, and Super Mario Bros. 3, which introduced fortresses, didn't have castles, it used airships instead. That's not counting Bowser's Castle, which obviously exists. The point is that castles weren't a stock stage type that appeared in every world. Yoshi's Island followed this new guideline religiously, with every world having a fortress as Stage 4 and a castle as Stage 8, and the new Super Mario Bros. Series also made sure to include a fortress and a castle in every world. It's a debatable point whether Super Mario World was the first Mario game to have a bonus world in it. The Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 had a World 9 that was pretty wacky, and also featured a message of congratulations to the player. That was probably a forerunner of the Special World. But what this game unquestionably added is the aesthetic of the Special World. The idea that it's way up in space and glowing with rainbow colors, a palette that would go on to be used in final stages for several Mario spin-offs. Rainbow Road, anyone? And finally, one more aesthetic touch. The idea of having a characteristic musical motif that represents the game as a whole, not just a specific stage type. Super Mario 64 implemented this in the same way that Super Mario World did. And over the last decade or so, it's been more the rule than the exception for Mario soundtracks. If you remember playing a Mario game and a certain song immediately pops into your head, from the da-da-da-da-da-da-da of the first two new Super Mario Bros. Games to Jump Up Superstar from Super Mario Odyssey, this game is at the root of it. Yoshi's Island really broke a lot of boundaries, not only for the Mario series, but for video games generally. It takes the traditional approach to things like difficulty, level design, and how the player interacts with enemies and turns it completely on its head. If Nintendo was going to take this as the direction for future Mario games, the series would have to change an awful lot to make that work. Of course, as it turns out, they never had any intention of doing that. With Super Mario 64 already well into development as a launch title for the upcoming and very hyped N64, Yoshi's Island was bound to be regarded as more of an experimental spin-off than the blueprint for Mario going forward, especially since most of its mechanics were designed for a little green dinosaur and not Mario himself. Given its place in the Mario canon, I'm actually surprised by how many things from Yoshi's Island showed up in later Mario games. Like Super Mario Bros. 2, this is a game that was so creative that even its weirdest elements are looked back on with nostalgia by a lot of people, some of whom still work for Nintendo today. Instead of being the foundation of future games, it's more like an old chest full of antiques that Nintendo goes back to now and then looking for something fun to reuse. For example, the whole storybook aesthetic of this game's introduction and backgrounds isn't the most popular style for Mario, which tends to rely on a harder-edged and more cartoonish look, but it seems to have influenced both of the Super Mario Galaxy games. Both of their intros are particularly storybookish and owe an obvious debt to Yoshi's Island. While there are no new major characters introduced here, we do see the first appearance of one of my favorite Mario villains, Kamek the Magic Koopa, whose characterization in the various games he's appeared in has varied from the original cackling, diabolical wizard to something more like a sarcastic babysitter in the Mario and Luigi games, where his relationship with the young Bowser makes him something like an evil Toadsworth. Although there already is an evil Toadsworth in that game, but I digress. Kamek doesn't just show back up in spin-offs, however. He appeared as a minor antagonist with his own boss fight in 2 of the new Super Mario Bros. Games, and was considered relevant enough to be included in the recent Super Mario Bros. Movie as Bowser's chief henchman. Many sources also insist that the Magic Koopa who shows up during the intro to Super Mario Galaxy to knock Mario out is in fact Kamek, although this doesn't have much of an effect on the actual game, in which he's replaced by a female counterpart called Camella. Still, he's a fairly compelling character as Mario villains go, and fights against him make for a pleasant change from the usual run of Koopalings, Boom Boom, and other bosses who you beat just by jumping on them. Speaking of jumping on things, that's something that Yoshi does a lot less than Mario, preferring to swallow his enemies or pick them off with eggs. But one move which Yoshi originated that would soon become a big deal in the main series was the ground pound, in which he leaps into the air and then slams down butt first, defeating enemies and pounding down obstacles in the process. This is one of the more important attacks in Super Mario 64, and within a few years it was such an essential move that everybody apparently forgot Yoshi did it first. Yoshi's Island was less of a pathbreaker in the field of enemy design, I suspect because most of this game's enemies are so well suited to Yoshi's specific moveset, though some, like bandits, could easily have been incorporated into the main series and just weren't. The only enemy that unambiguously showed up in a future mainline Mario game was Fly Guy, a shy guy with a propeller on his head that lets him soar just out of reach of your attacks. And he only appeared in a few levels of Super Mario 64, making his inclusion like an Easter egg as much as anything else. Penguins and monkeys both reappeared in future Mario games with a somewhat different appearance, and of course in this game they're both enemies, while future games used them as NPCs you can talk to, but I suppose there's at least a loose connection at work here. But the overall design of Yoshi's Island is where its influence on future games is most nebulous. Which doesn't mean it didn't have an influence, but it's never been copied directly like the original trilogy. The stages in Yoshi's Island are designed like no Mario game before it, with sprawling layouts and much more intricate puzzles even than its nominal predecessor, Super Mario World. Yoshi's moveset is more diverse than Mario's, prior to Super Mario 64 at least, and the level design exploits every little wrinkle of it, as well as individual stage gimmicks that alter Yoshi's abilities. The future Mario game that's the most like Yoshi's Island is probably Super Mario 3D World, simply because of its frequent use of locks and keys to force the player out of the rhythm of platforming and into puzzle-solving mode. But 3D World is faster paced than Yoshi's Island and features simpler puzzles and level design. It really isn't that similar, it just reminds me of the older game every now and then. The idea of temporarily turning into Yoshi-like vehicles with special powers could easily have inspired the capture system from Odyssey, in which Mario can use Cappy to inhabit various enemies and objects to use their abilities. And of course, while ideas like swallowing enemies and the flutter jump were never made part of Mario's identity, they did show back up in all the games that included Yoshi as a power-up, like Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Galaxy 2. One of the most interesting things about Super Mario 64 to me is how big an impact it had on future Mario games, despite striking out in most of the areas I've been considering so far: characters, story, enemies, and gameplay mechanics. In terms of things that stuck around, only the last one makes a strong showing here, and the vast majority of its innovations fall under what I would call general design. The story premise of Super Mario 64, that Peach has been trapped in her own castle by Bowser, and Mario must take back the magic power of the castle to rescue her, was at the same time too simple and too specific to inspire future Mario games. Its most notable aspect is the setting, Peach's castle, which wasn't reused in a 3D Mario game until a considerably downsized and simplified version appeared in Super Mario Odyssey. The castle is an important symbol to Mario, like the Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella castles are to Disney, but no other game uses it the way Super Mario 64 does, as a level hub and the home of most of the game's secrets. Funnily enough, the Mario RPGs do a lot more with the castle than the main games do. The final boss fights of both Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi Partners in Time take place there, and in Partners in Time it serves as the level hub too. By the way, who would have thought that Super Mario 64 and Partners in Time would end up sharing something this essential in common? This is almost as good as Ocarina of Time and Phantom Hourglass ending up together in that Zelda video I did last year. As for the other half of that first category, Super Mario 64 didn't introduce any major characters to the series, but it's only fair to credit it with a few small refinements. For instance, it reintroduced Toads as friendly NPCs, and gave them unique dialogue for the first time, arguably doing for their image what Yoshi's Island had just done for the Shy Guys. It's easy to forget that in 1996, Toad hadn't appeared in a normal Mario game for around 7 years, since the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 in 1988. Yoshi kind of booted him out of the franchise for a while, and this game reversed that trend by elevating Toad and giving Yoshi just a minor cameo. These days, Toad is a much bigger part of the Super Mario series than Yoshi, who's drifted into more of an independent role as the star of his own sub-series, and that's a development that definitely began with this game. Super Mario 64 also marks the first appearance of penguins as a friendly NPC type. They were a natural fit for the snowy levels, and while I'd bet that Nintendo didn't originally expect them to join the stock NPC pantheon, they've been in 3 other mainline Mario games since then, not to mention the Paper Mario series. There are a few other small things, like Talking Boos and the Loch Ness Monster-inspired Dory, who returned in Odyssey, but none of this is on the same level as a new major character, or even the Koopalings from Super Mario Bros. 3. Then we have enemies. Super Mario 64's new enemies have kind of a thrown-together quality to them. They're very geometrical and garish, like characters from a really early computer-generated cartoon, and most of them look like something you could make in 5 minutes with some silly putty, a bag of pipe cleaners, and a couple of cans of spray paint. The most important new enemy is probably Womp, the big stone slab with legs who waddles around trying to headbutt you into the ground. He got a whole level named after him, and he showed up in a handful of later games, but he's not nearly as prominent as his brother from another mother, Thwomp. We also have Amps, basically Podoboos except electrical and in 3D, which are a staple of the new Super Mario Bros. Games for some reason, and Skeeters, very clearly inspired by Water Striders, who managed to swing an appearance in Super Mario Sunshine and a few levels of Super Mario Galaxy 2. When we come to gameplay mechanics, we're on much firmer ground. Super Mario 64 introduced a set of jumps and bounds that would serve as the foundation of Mario's 3D movement, all the way through to Super Mario Odyssey, and probably well into the future. The idea of sequential jumps giving you greater vertical reach is crucial to the design of many levels, and it feels so natural here, it's easy to forget that previous Mario games didn't have this feature. Punching and kicking to attack didn't last long, being replaced by water spraying in Super Mario Sunshine and the spin attack in Galaxy. But the ground pound and mid-air dive are still very relevant today. The mid-air dive in particular is a key component of the super flexible movement seen in Super Mario Odyssey, which allows players with good timing to travel vast distances without ever touching a platform. I also think it's worth noting that Super Mario 64 was the first game in the series with a generic interact command that allowed Mario to read signs, talk to NPCs, and carry objects around with the same button used for punching. Context sensitivity was used here not just to make Mario himself more dynamic, but to create a world that he could really interact with, instead of just watching it speed by from left to right. Where we really hit the jackpot, though, is general design. Super Mario 64's overall structure was highly influential, with a hub area leading to individual worlds full of self-contained missions, as well as a few bonus collectibles accessible directly from the hub through secret stages. Sunshine did this with Delfino Plaza, and its links to the various resorts around Isle Delfino, and Galaxy repeated it with the Comet Observatory and the dozens of galaxies it overlooks. Galaxy 2 was the first 3D game in the series to break this precedent, adopting a more traditional world map in the vein of Super Mario Bros. 3, but it still had a hub and still used missions to break up its levels. From there, the concept was modified even further, with Odyssey dispensing with the hub and introducing a new mission structure in which only some main collectibles would lead to a stage reset, with most only briefly pausing the action. Nevertheless, the concept is a robust one and could easily be used again. But in addition to their structure, the nature of Super Mario 64's worlds was a big influence on other games, both within and outside its own series. Mario games had always had a certain fantastic quality about them, particularly Super Mario World, with its candy-colored switch palaces, and areas with names like Donut Plains and Choco Island. But in a 2D environment, the craziness of the level design was purely an aesthetic choice. In Super Mario 64, you don't just see crazy things, you do crazy things, and the game gives you a wide variety of appropriately themed arenas to do them in. These courses range from low-fidelity simulations of a real place, like Cool Cool Mountain, Jolly Roger Bay, or Shifting Sandland, to more tropey fictional concepts. Big Boo's Haunt as a haunted mansion, Whomp's Fortress as a castle in the sky, etc. And at the far end of the realism scale, worlds that are so abstract and gamey that they defy comparison to any real location, like Wet Dry World, Tick-Tock Clock, and all 3 Bowser stages. Not all of these places are what you'd call immersive, but each one has an immediately recognizable style, which complements the challenges you find in it. The worlds in Super Mario 64 are the most memorable parts of it, and that made it unique. I'm just going off of my own personal experience here, but while I love the worlds from Super Mario Bros. 3, I think it's the power-ups, and even more so the new enemies, that stick out in my mind after playing it, rather than the worlds and their themes. And with both Super Mario World and Yoshi's Island, it's not the worlds that I remember so much as individual stages. World 1 in Yoshi's Island is never going to be as iconic as the stage Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy, which appears in it. And in Super Mario World, the worlds aren't even that consistent. You find underground stages in Donut Plains, and an underwater one in the Forest of Illusion. Nintendo EAD's dedication to respecting the world themes they came up with was always tempered by the desire for variety inside each world. But with Super Mario 64, world design took center stage. Because you were visiting the same course every time you went back for another mission, rather than playing a new stage entirely, consistency was now just as important as variety. You had to believe that this was the same place, whether or not all the same things were there, for the game to even make sense. So they put more thought into each one's overall theme, and the result was a set of very memorable worlds. And this was just the beginning. Most of Super Mario 64's flaws, if you can even call them that, stem from the fact that it was the first of its kind. Like a real-world dollhouse, the courses in Super Mario 64 make a little bit of detail go a long way, with the gap being papered over by your own imagination. In retrospect, I don't actually think that's a defect, but later games that adopted the same template did more to sell the atmosphere, like Rare's Banjo-Kazooie, with its chatty protagonists and abundance of theme-appropriate NPCs, or Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter, with its deeper history and more fleshed-out narrative. The gates had been thrown wide open. From late 1996 onward, Nintendo EAD could take the 3D Mario concept and go in pretty much any direction their imaginations carried them. In keeping with its fluke status, the legacy that Super Mario Sunshine left in the Mario series is almost exactly opposite to the one left by Super Mario 64. That game's innovations were structural and gameplay-oriented, while here the influence is mostly in the realm of story and characters. Super Mario 64 didn't introduce a single new character to the series, and its only real character-based innovation was the idea of friendly NPCs based on enemy characters like Koopas. Sunshine, on the other hand, came up with 3 recurring characters of varying degrees of importance. Toadsworth is probably my favorite, mostly because of his role in Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, but like Egad from Luigi's Mansion, his time in the sun was very short. He's not the first Toad to have a unique appearance. Way back in 1996, the Chancellor from Super Mario RPG was rocking a sweet stash himself. But this is the first time a unique Toad appeared in a mainline Mario game. It's reflective of the increasing influence that the Mario RPGs were having on the main series. I'm sure that has something to do with Koizumi, who worked on Zelda and Mario at the same time. The next one may come as a bit of a surprise to you. It's Petey Piranha, the walking, barfing piranha plant who wreaks havoc during the missions in Bianco Hills. Along with Gooper Blooper, he was the first recurring mini-boss in a 3D Mario game. Unlike Gooper Blooper, people actually seem to like Petey. He reappeared as a boss fight in New Super Mario Bros., and the Dino Piranha from Galaxy is a pretty obvious takeoff on him. He's also a common presence in sports titles, as well as Mario Kart, Mario Party, and even the Subspace Emissary campaign in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Nintendo has not forgotten Petey, I guarantee it. But the award for most relevant definitely goes to Bowser Jr., who looks almost exactly like Baby Bowser from Yoshi's Island, but has a different, more playful personality. Bowser Jr. has been the second most common major antagonist in Mario games for the last 20 years, since he was introduced. He shows up in all but one of the new Super Mario Bros. Games, Galaxy and its sequel, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. The Bowser's Fury add-on to Super Mario 3D World went a step further, by putting him in an unlikely team-up with Mario to save his dad from the big goop disease. And this is the only Mario game I know of where you can play as a villain character. I'm not counting Odyssey, because that's you playing as Mario playing as Bowser, which is not the same thing. And speaking of Odyssey, that's the one major Mario game that Junior hasn't showed up in. He's essentially replaced by the Broodals, since Bowser is planning his wedding through the whole story. Although I don't know why you wouldn't want your son to show up at your wedding. Maybe Junior's still mad about being tricked into thinking Peach was his mom, and Bowser doesn't want to bring up the whole stepmom thing. I don't know. Sunshine's non-character-related story stuff wasn't as influential, with the basic plot once again being Bowser kidnaps Peach while she's on vacation, just like in Super Mario World. But the exotic setting seems to have inspired a few places, like the Beach Bowl Galaxy and the Seaside Kingdom. And the attempt at telling individual world stories was somewhat preserved in Galaxy, though it was more difficult to do so there with its smaller number of missions per world. But one last character-related point is the Piantas. For a very brief period, these guys were big. They showed up as major characters in Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, and in a galaxy in Super Mario Galaxy 2. They're also all over the background in various Mario Kart games which have used an Isle Delfino-themed track, which is most of them. I think Nintendo just really liked the way they look, because Noki's didn't fare nearly as well despite being similarly interesting. The enemy roster of Super Mario Sunshine was pretty idiosyncratic, like Super Mario 64's, except that it featured even fewer returning Mario favorites, along with almost no new mainstays. The one enemy I can think of that popped up again is, curiously, the Cataquacks, who only appear on Gelato Beach. They showed back up in 2 levels in Super Mario Galaxy, and on the side of a Mario Kart Double Dash track themed after Gelato Beach. That's about it. Shadow Mario never reappeared, strictly speaking, but I wouldn't be surprised if the idea of chasing him down was part of the inspiration for the races with Cosmic Mario from Galaxy, and the Cosmic Clones, who appeared in later games to give you trouble while collecting coins. As for gameplay, the Flood was a one-off, though it did reappear as one of Mario's special moves in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. No new basic platforming moves were invented here either, although I believe the dive works better here and is closer to how it works in Odyssey. It's also possible that this game's version of the spin jump helped to inspire the controller waggle spin, which is so essential to Galaxy. They do look similar, to be sure, but that's pure speculation on my part. That leaves us with general design. As with so much else in Sunshine, I think the overall structure is actually pretty good. Fewer worlds with more content in each is my cup of tea, more so than Super Mario 64 with its 15 major courses. But just because something is good doesn't mean it's the future. Having a central hub in the first place wasn't sticking around for long. Only Galaxy would repeat this, and even its sequel switched to a world map, as did Super Mario 3D Land and World, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and even Super Mario Odyssey, though admittedly its worlds tend to be a wee bit larger than in previous outings. The games that use a world map rather than a hub do tend to make you complete most of their stages, but I can't credit this as an influence from Sunshine, because it's obviously a carryover from earlier 2D Mario games that used the same map structure. The blue coin idea didn't carry over to future games either. While you can trade coins for progression collectibles in later games, notably Odyssey, these are just normal coins that you might pick up anywhere. The idea of getting collectibles 1/10 at a time was phased out quickly, and many areas that might have had a blue coin in Sunshine instead have a 1-up, a power-up item, or even a whole collectible. In some ways, Super Mario Sunshine was the high watermark of 3D Mario game design. It had the most story cutscenes, the most flavor text, and an actual attempt at voice acting for its major characters. There are times when it feels like a movie, or more properly, a goofy kids show. And that's not an impression I've felt from any other Mario game before or since. But that also makes it the least Mario-ish 3D Mario game. It went out on a limb with lots of crazy ideas, and while many people liked them, more people thought the series was drifting out to sea and needed to be pulled in for its own good. Future games would never be allowed to be this un-Mario ever again. Since so few of the unique elements of each new Super Mario Bros. Game became essential parts of the series as a whole, with at least one apparently leaving no lasting impact at all, I'm going to include all 4 of them here. Otherwise, this part would probably be 2 minutes long. You wouldn't think that a game with barely any story would have much of an impact on future stories in the Mario series. And you'd be right. The only thing I can really think of is the introduction of Bowser Jr., originally a 3D Mario character, into a 2D setting. I suppose you could also count the skeletal form of Bowser that's introduced here, known as Dry Bowser, who reappeared in the special world of Super Mario 3D World, and several spin-offs. Since the other 3 games in the series have a virtually identical story, there's not much to say for them either. But New Super Mario Bros. U did introduce the recurring character Nabbit, a purple bunny-hooded thief who bears a striking resemblance to Ravio from A Link Between Worlds. Nabbit started out as an antagonist who steals items from Mario, but soon after he became an ally and a playable character. Nabbit represented the first super easy difficulty option in Mario. Clearly intended to be played by very young children, Nabbit is invulnerable to all damage that doesn't result in instant death, though lava, poison, bottomless pits, and the like still work on him. Not the most interesting character in the world, to be honest, but he has his fans. It's certainly better than nothing, which is what the rest of the games offered. Gameplay is a more interesting affair. These games certainly introduced new power-ups, enemies, and level elements, but then again, so did Yoshi's Island and its sequels. The trouble is that they mostly stayed confined to the new Super Mario Bros. Sub-series. Admittedly, there's only been one major 2D Mario game since the end of that sub-series, so theoretically a lot of this stuff could come back in the future. But I don't have a crystal ball, so we have to stick to what we know. The Mega Mushroom from New Super Mario Bros. Did reappear in Super Mario 3D World as a normal power-up, but the Mini Mushroom, which lets him run on water, jump higher than usual, and pass through small gaps, stayed confined to the sub-series and a few spin-offs. The Penguin Suit and Propeller Mushroom from New Super Mario Bros. Wii didn't break out of the sub-series either, nor did the coin-generating Gold Flower from New Super Mario Bros. 2, or the Super Acorn from New Super Mario Bros. U that turns Mario into Flying Squirrel Mario. I sound like I'm making this up, but I swear to God I'm not. Aside from Dry Bowser, no recurring bosses were introduced throughout the whole series, although you mostly fight Bowser Jr. and various Koopalings. Those are recurring characters, it's just that they predate the sub-series, so I can't give it credit for creating them. And I'm fairly certain that none of the original enemies from the new Super Mario Bros. Games appeared in any future Mario game. There are a lot of them, though, so it's possible one slipped my mind. General design is the hardest one to pin down. I really have no idea if New Super Mario Bros.' simplified, no-nonsense level design had any significant impact on how the stages in, say, Super Mario Wonder or Super Mario 3D Land were developed. There are some elements which they have in common, particularly the length of stages. But then again, classic Mario stages could also be quite brief sometimes. The whole idea of using cannons to skip worlds, or beating bosses with a special power-up to access alternate worlds, doesn't seem to have escaped the sub-series. Future games did go with the world map idea, both 2D and 3D ones, but I don't know how much the success of New Super Mario Bros. Influenced that. It certainly didn't originate the concept. That would be Super Mario Bros. 3. The biggest general design thing that any of these games added to the series is definitely New Super Mario Bros. Wii's implementation of 4-person multiplayer, later seen in Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario Wonder. There's been a lot of talk about how this has changed Mario level design, mostly for the worse, But the fun you can have bumping around these levels, with 3 other people helping, hindering, and haranguing you at every turn, adds a wonderful social dimension to what had traditionally been a very solitary experience. I love it when Mario games try to be funny, but the multiplayer-focused Mario games are funny without Nintendo even having to try. I wouldn't want to see it in every Mario game, but if a console generation ever goes by without at least one total nonsense generator along these lines, I'd be disappointed. And the fact that Super Mario Galaxy's design is something of a compromise between the 2D and 3D entries in the series makes its legacy in the overall Mario series difficult to judge, since it takes a lot of inspiration from both of those types of game, and it's sometimes hard to tell what's an innovation and what's simply a minor tweak on an existing concept. So for the purposes of this series, we'll stick to what we know. Another complicating factor is the existence of a direct sequel to this game, Super Mario Galaxy 2, which for obvious reasons contains many of the same challenges, enemies, NPCs, and so on as the first game. I tend not to count things as legacy-worthy if only one subsequent game used them anyway, but in this case I'll make the rule explicit. If it only reappeared in Super Mario Galaxy 2, it doesn't make the cut. Galaxy's most important contribution to storytelling in Mario, like Sunshine's, is a character rather than a plot element. In this case, Rosalina, the Watcher of the Stars. Like practically everything in Galaxy, Rosalina's design is rather simple, but appealing and evocative in its own way. I especially like how the game shifts between presenting her as a normal human being who just happened to fall in with the Lumas, and then as some kind of cosmic spirit who never ages and is able to touch the heartstrings of the universe and all that jazz. Is she actually 2 characters in one? Is her appearance at the end of the story just a vision Mario is having? Or some kind of telepathic communication? Who can say? It's cool, that's what's important. Another thing I like about Rosalina is that she represents a new wrinkle on the old concept of Mario visiting kingdoms with a monarch who rules over a particular fantasy race. Princess Peach and her Toad attendants were the only example of this in the mainline Mario series for a long time, with even the various kings in Super Mario Bros. 3 all being served by Toads, instead of each one having unique NPCs. The Mario RPGs went in some interesting directions with this concept, but it didn't recur in the main series until the appearance of Rosalina and her Lumas. And boy, if we're talking about simple but appealing, these star babies are the epitome of that. You could probably draw one in 3 seconds. They look like cake decorations, but their dialogue and some very endearing sound design sells them as actual characters with feelings. Less celebrated in the annals of Mario history is the debut in Galaxy of the Toad Brigade and its fearless leader, Captain Toad. In case you didn't realize, this is in fact the same character who later shows up in Super Mario 3D World, Super Mario Odyssey, and even his very own spin-off, a game which gives a lot of credence to my Polly Pocket theory about Super Mario 64. As I mentioned earlier, Captain Toad always puts a smile on my face when I see him in this game, but the cherry on top is his interactions with the other members of the brigade, which is why it's a shame that they don't show up nearly as often as he does. I think they deserve more recognition than they've received from Nintendo, so let's do a little roll call here and show them some appreciation. Male Toad, Glasses, What's-His-Face, the Lazy One. Take a bow, all of you. You've earned it. And that's pretty much it for story stuff. As for aesthetic influences, Galaxy has a great art style, but not one that I would call definitive for future entries. In the field of music, on the other hand, it's probably worth noting Galaxy's use of a full symphony orchestra for some themes, which adds mountains of oomph to their aesthetic impact. You know, it just occurred to me that I didn't really talk about the music in either Super Mario 64 or Sunshine when I was discussing those games a few months ago. I guess that's because the soundtracks in those games, even when they're good, don't leave a huge impression on me. Frankly, I think 64's soundtrack isn't very good. It almost seems unfinished, with some tracks being reused in worlds they barely seem suited to. Check out Tick-Tock Clock, for instance. Sunshine uses a selection of pleasant, laid-back themes for its levels, and they're good, memorable even, but they don't stand out enough to be as impressive as tracks like Gusty Garden Galaxy, or even the Good Egg Galaxy in this game. Future Mario games have leaned pretty heavily on music to sell their style, so I think it's fair to credit Galaxy with starting this trend. It's not the first time Mario had great music, but it is the first time that a Mario game chose to define itself through music. As for enemies and gameplay, unfortunately, even though Galaxy was really creative in this area, relatively few of its innovations were held onto for future entries. The sole recurring enemy is the oddly named Electro Goomba, which reappeared in the bonus world of Super Mario 3D World, now called Octoomba. These Octorok-like nuisances do a respectable job as a spacey substitute for Goombas, and they would probably be more prominent, except that Galaxy is also full of regular Goombas, so Electro Goombas don't have much of a reason to exist. One thing that isn't an enemy, but is certainly a threat, is the Pulse Beam, a little robotic trap that sends out concentric laser beams which briefly stun and damage Mario. Super Mario Odyssey found room for a couple of these guys in its roster, which is nice because they do a lot to spice up otherwise dull moving platform sections. As far as Mario's own moveset is concerned, Galaxy reintroduced the long jump, which Sunshine had stripped out, but it didn't add much that was new. Spinning is quite a versatile addition here, but future games didn't see fit to make use of it, with the partial exception of Super Mario 3D World, in which playing as Rosalina allows you to perform a very similar mid-air spin. But that's not Mario using the spin, so it would be a stretch to count that. And we have two minor level elements that Galaxy introduced. The first is the idea of chasing after multicolored musical notes that hover in midair to unlock some objective or bonus. Odyssey was very fond of this particular gimmick, and used it in almost every world. Not present in Odyssey, but appearing in Super Mario 3D World, are flip switches, which change from blue to yellow when Mario treads on them, and allow progress when everyone in an area has been activated, signified by their turning bright green. Finally, we have general design, and to be honest, I'm drawing a blank on this one. It's not that there's anything wrong with Galaxy's overall mission structure or level design, it's just that as far as I can tell, future games took next to no inspiration from it. Even Galaxy 2, which you would expect to follow pretty closely in its forebear's footsteps, while it does use a lot of the same level design, has a very different overall structure. Where Sunshine was pretty inflexible in terms of which missions you had to do, and Galaxy was the most lenient of all the 3D Mario games, only demanding 60 out of the available 120 Power Stars, Galaxy 2 is, structurally speaking, a regression all the way back to the days of Super Mario Bros. 3, in which new worlds are unlocked just one or two at a time through a world map. And since there are fewer stars per galaxy, it's no longer possible to focus on the ones you like. You pretty much have to do a little of everything, just not 90% of everything, like in Sunshine. Future mainline Mario games went with this structure, rather than the more open-ended one found in Galaxy. Games like Super Mario 3D World would prove to be even more restrictive than Galaxy 2, making you play through the majority of stages, with just a few optional exceptions. And this is all the more curious in a series that, after Galaxy, never showed much interest in telling stories through its game design again. Linearity and storytelling work well together, but as the Mario games have become more linear over the last 15 years, they still haven't brought back the dramatic quality that distinguishes Sunshine and Galaxy. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not one of those Mario games that have a clear and obvious impact on the design of the games that came after. As both a direct sequel to a game that there weren't going to be any more sequels to, and a self-consciously experimental project, it was never going to be seen as a prototype for the next big thing, not even to the extent of, say, New Super Mario Bros. In 2006. Rather, like Super Mario Bros. 2 back in the late 80s, Galaxy 2 would have a sort of stealth influence on the future course of the Mario series, generating ideas that would be tinkered with, and maybe appear years later in a considerably altered form. Lubba, for instance, that pudgy, lovable ship captain who really doesn't do much when you get right down to it, was never a major character again, but when Rosalina pops up in spin-offs, it's not uncommon for Lubba to be part of her crew. And the Whittles, little tree people who bear a passing resemblance to the Japanese forest sprites called Kodama, also never hit the mainstream. A sad mistake in my opinion, but they did make it into a few Mario Party games years later. Nevertheless, Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not a serious contributor to the Mario lore book, deliberately so. There's barely a story, only a few new characters who are basically confined to this one game, and the bosses no longer speak at all except for Bowser, Bowser Jr., and the Womp King, oddly, although his spiel is just the same as in Super Mario 64. Galaxy 2 does feature the triumphant return of Yoshi after his absence from the original Galaxy, but it would be a stretch to call him a character here. The one noteworthy thing about Yoshi here isn't the beginning of anything, but the end of something. This is in fact the last mainline Mario game in which Yoshi speaks. Yeah, did you forget that Yoshi used to be able to talk? You're not alone. He's been mute for so long, except in the RPGs, which Nintendo barely makes anymore, that many people don't realize classic Yoshi spoke perfectly natural human language for more than a decade. Even I forgot that Yoshi talks in this game, so when you first meet him I was shocked, pleasantly shocked, to find him yapping about his captured friends, just like in Super Mario World. In terms of enemies and gameplay, if nothing else, Galaxy 2 is very much its father's son. There are lots of new and interesting enemies here, but the vast majority were left behind when Mario went in a more nostalgic direction with Super Mario 3D Land and its sequel. What these games do share with each other is a renewal of interest in some classic 2D Mario enemies that hadn't yet been translated into 3D, most notably the Hammer Bros and Boomerang Bros. There's one brand new enemy who returned in a single future game, the Fizzlet, a pesky purple blob that can melt into a puddle of pure electricity on demand. They're a fairly common enemy, and a memorable one, but far from the most challenging. Someone at Nintendo must have had a soft spot for them, though, because they showed back up in Super Mario 3D World, looking a bit worse for wear, but still just as much of a nuisance as ever. But game mechanics are what Galaxy 2 really focused on, and several of these would be repurposed for later Mario games. Beat blocks, which appear and disappear with musical rhythm in several stages, were a big hit in 3D Land and 3D World, as were flip-swap panels, which flip whenever the player spins. Obviously, this was changed to jumping in future games, since Mario doesn't spin in those. The Cosmic Spirit, which shows up to help you out if you die too many times, never showed up again in exactly this form. But Super Mario 3D Land had a helper function that was activated the same way. Future games would address this issue by just being easier to begin with, or letting you play as invincible characters, like Nabbit. And in a more abstract sense, there are power-ups, like the Dash Pepper, and mission types, like the ones where you fetch a Goomba or Top Man for the Gearmos, which seem to be clear inspirations for similar things in Odyssey, specifically the Rocket Flower, and the missions where you possess an enemy and bring it to the Bonitor Biologist. But if you look at trends in Mario, I think the area where Super Mario Galaxy 2 was most influential, albeit in an obscure way, is general design. Like Super Mario Galaxy, this game is defined in large part by its status as a compromise. But in this case, it's not a compromise between the approaches of previous 3D Mario games, like Galaxy was, but instead a compromise between the approach of Galaxy and that of New Super Mario Bros. The first two Mario games set in 3D were heavily based on exploring the environment of each world. Super Mario 64 expected you to spend upwards of half an hour in each painting world, and these worlds were complex and highly interactive to encourage immersion. Super Mario Sunshine pushed even harder in this direction, with only 7 main worlds, about half as many, and more content in each. But Super Mario Galaxy went in the opposite direction, with many of its levels being 10 to 15 minute snacks rather than full-course meals. And Super Mario Galaxy 2 is another leap in the direction of bite-siziness. Not only is a typical Galaxy now smaller, but you also tend to go through them faster, thanks to more streamlined level design and a lot of power-ups that either directly or indirectly increase your speed. Many of the levels are also now more lethal, leading to a higher level of challenge, but also more deaths that force you to repeat earlier sections of the level. This can have the paradoxical effect of making a Galaxy feel more repetitive, even when it's supposed to feel faster. Galaxy 2's approach to both level design and map structure, while neither was totally original, were the future for Mario, reappearing with only slight alterations in Super Mario 3D World, Super Mario Wonder, and even Super Mario Odyssey, despite Odyssey's self-conscious intent to be more like the earlier 3D Mario games. Another thing shared by Galaxy 2 and Odyssey is an absolute flood of collectibles that individually have very little value or meaning. Galaxy's levels weren't as detailed as Sunshine's, but it did still seem to be going for immersion most of the time. Galaxy 2, on the other hand, keeps trying to distract you all the time with piles of coins and 1-ups, most of which are completely useless to a normal player, particularly since there's no really serious punishment for getting a game over. Not only that, but every time you reboot the game, your 1-up counter is reset to 5, a Mario tradition that had long outlived its heyday by 2010, and the gameplay equivalent of an inflamed appendix. I've heard a few people criticize Odyssey for deflating the value of its power moons by strewing them all over the place and handing them out whenever you do anything, from defeating a major boss to scratching Toad's nose for him. Yet I've never seen anyone trace this collectible overload back to its source, which is pretty obvious in retrospect. Sunshine's blue coins. Nah, I'm just kidding. Sort of. I do actually think that it's Galaxy 2's practice of salting its levels with copious amounts of 1-ups, coin troves, and life mushrooms — good God, are there too many life mushrooms in this game — that ultimately led to that superficially tempting but deeply flawed decision in Odyssey. When I go back to... So, yeah, this section won't take long. Super Mario 3D Land did not add a single major character or story element to the series. Like the new Super Mario Bros. Games, it's far more conspicuous for how little story there is than for what its story actually is. If anything, I suppose it can be credited with the idea of the final battle with Bowser being more of a platforming gauntlet than a straight fight, although there are clear precedents for this in previous Mario games, including Sunshine. Plus, this is more of a gameplay development than a story one, even if it does affect the tone of the finale. Speaking of gameplay, you won't be surprised to hear that, as a game which pulls as many level elements as it can get away with from older Mario games, Super Mario 3D Land isn't a huge net contributor of gameplay ideas either. Most of its level gimmicks are a variation on earlier ideas, and its few wholly original concepts, like the tapering metal platforms that sink one level at a time into the lava in Bowser stages, weren't repeated in any later games. It did manage to get a few of its new enemies reused, however. The Goomba stack, a tower of Goombas that can be stomped flat all at once for a satisfying bonus, was brought back not only for 3D World, but also for Odyssey, where they're the key to getting a few hidden power moons. And the Bua-like Peepas found their way into New Super Mario Bros. 2, making them something more than a one-off variant of a classic enemy. None of Mario's moves in Super Mario 3D Land is completely new, but by nerfing the side jump and making you charge up to do a backflip, it does succeed in de-emphasizing vertical movement and giving more utility to rolling around and somersaulting, which stuck around all the way through to Super Mario Odyssey, a game where you roll so much that Sonic the Hedgehog would be jealous. And finally, in general design terms, Super Mario 3D Land's contribution to the series isn't necessarily specific choices that it made, but rather its attitude. With this game, the Tokyo team decided to let 2D and 3D Mario merge in a way that would previously have been considered a betrayal. Auto-scrolling stages, coin heavens, every boss just being a Bowser encounter, these are concepts that the series had left behind in the world of 2D for more than a decade. But Super Mario 3D Land went back and dusted them off, and in much the same vein as New Super Mario Bros., discovered that they still had a lot of life in them. You can see this as a bold experiment for 3D Mario, or a concession to the consistently higher sales of 2D Mario. But either way, this was the direction Nintendo would take going forward, at least until Super Mario Odyssey. Because Super Mario 3D World is a kind of greatest hits that reuses so many elements from previous Mario games, it mostly missed out on the potential of adding elements to the Mario legacy. Where some other Mario game would have invented a new enemy or platform or what have you to solve a design problem, 3D World typically finds a solution in something that already existed. Another problem with this game, from a legacy standpoint, is that even though it came out more than a decade ago, there's only been one proper 3D game following it so far, Super Mario Odyssey. In this series, I've only been counting things as part of the Mario legacy if they reappeared in at least 2 subsequent games, but that isn't a fair standard for 3D World because there simply aren't enough things after it to compare it to. So for this final segment, I'm going to relax the standard a little. If anything in Super Mario 3D World reappears in Odyssey at all, I'm counting it as part of the legacy. The games are different enough that it's noteworthy when they share things in common. And while we don't yet know anything about Nintendo's plans for following up on Odyssey, it's a safe bet that at least a few things from that game will stick around. That's how Mario has always worked. Oh, and don't worry, even with this lower standard, the list of legacy elements from 3D World is still pretty short. Take story, for instance. The real question is, what story? For all the spectacle and dramatic music that 3D World is full of, its story is no more developed than the one from 3D Land, or any other successor, spiritual or otherwise, to the new Super Mario Bros. Series. 3D World introduces us to the Sprixies, little fairy princesses that can fly and build things with magic, but they never talk or fight back against Bowser, so they're not really characters, properly speaking. It's refreshing to be saving someone other than Peach for a change, but I wouldn't say the Sprixies particularly add anything to the experience. Bowser never even explains why he locked them up or how he expects to use their magic, because he never talks either. Aesthetically, 3D World is a very pretty game, but its overall look is just as derivative as everything else about it. Like the original Super Mario World, it takes elements that were blocky and monochromatic in the previous game and rounds off all the sharp edges, while also adding rainbow colors and a heaping dollop of cuteness. Shigefumi Hino would be very proud. The most unique-looking levels, as opposed to good-looking, would probably be the Captain Toad challenges, which take the dollhouse idea I brought up while discussing Super Mario 64 and develop it even further. These stages are unbelievably toyetic. They look like you could actually make a real playset out of them, like a Mario-themed Polly Pocket. Obviously, the idea inspired the later spin-off Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, but it doesn't seem to have done much for the mainline Mario series, which is probably just as well. While its huge enemy roster is mostly taken from past games, 3D World did manage to contribute 2 enemies to the classic shortlist. The first of these is Parabones, a flying dry bones. Not that creative of an idea, especially since both Paracoopas and Dry Bones are just Koopa variations to begin with, but it counts. Also reappearing in Odyssey are the Typhoos, giant menacing clouds which try to blow you off of high cliffs. Not terribly impressive, I admit, but at least it managed to beat Galaxy 2. As for other gameplay elements, the moveset is largely unchanged from 3D Land, but this game does have its implementation of asymmetric multiplayer, which was an influence not on Odyssey, but on the most recent 2D Mario game, Super Mario Wonder, although differences between characters in that game aren't as fleshed out as they are here. Most of the humanoid characters play exactly the same. One minor idea which did come back in Odyssey was glowing spots on the ground, which can be ground pounded to bring up a collectible or power-up. Odyssey really liked this concept, and used it together with the kickable rocks from Galaxy 2 to hide some of its trickiest power moons. Oh, and one thing which I probably should have brought up while talking about Super Mario 3D Land is how much the boomerang power-up resembles Cappy from Odyssey. Both items are thrown out, hover in place briefly, then return to Mario, and are capable of picking up collectibles for him. I can't be sure that the boomerang is what Cappy grew out of as a concept, but it seems like a pretty safe bet. Actually, Odyssey shares quite a bit more in common with 3D World than you'd think, given Nintendo's separation of the two into separate camps. The compartmentalized nature of 3D World's stages, full of isolated and optional challenge rooms, is a lot like Odyssey's kingdoms and their sub-areas which lead to power moons. The simple challenges, which appear in mystery houses one after the other, show back up in Odyssey as well, now integrated into each kingdom's overworld. Even the level design isn't always that different. The more open stages in 3D World, like World 5's Sunshine Seaside, could easily be mistaken for part of Odyssey's world at first glance.